he said, "You realize you're camping in an elephant corridor," and I was like, "What does that sort of mean?" He said the elephants will tend to come through here at night time, and I'd already pitched my tent, and it was getting dark. But he was also quite relaxed about it. He said it should be okay as long as you have the light on in your tent. And then he went away, and I went to bed, and it happened to be like a full moon that night. It was really beautiful, clear sky. It was so light, and we'd exchanged numbers, and he'd sent me a text message at like 9 o'clock at night saying, "You don't need to put the light on in your tent because of the full moon. You'll be okay." And there were no elephants overnight, but then in the morning at sunrise, when I got up, I think to take a photo, I was making tea. I could just suddenly hear noises like, 50 meters, 100 meters behind me. And I turned round and there were two elephants running.
Welcome to the Seek Travel Ride podcast, where we share the stories and experiences of people who have undertaken amazing adventures by bike. Whether it's crossing state borders, mountain ranges, countries or continents, we want to share that spirit of adventuring on two wheels with our listeners. Hello, I'm your host, Bella Malloy, and I'm very excited to introduce my guest for today's episode of Seek Travel Ride, Peter Gostelow. Peter has spent almost 2 decades exploring this world slowly on a bicycle. If his name sounds familiar, listeners, it's because I first featured Peter as a guest of the show just under a year ago. For that episode, we spoke about his experiences of bike travel up to that point. From taking his first incredible adventure, spending over 3 years cycling from Japan all the way back to the UK, to his subsequent vast journey across the African continent. I'm very much picking up where we left off, as it was the very day that I first interviewed Peter that he boarded a plane to embark on his next bike travelling adventure. He started that one off in Jordan, where he rode the Jordan Bike Trail, a mostly off-road route taking in some of the steepest roads the country has to offer, which, of course, it must be said, serve up the most dreamy of landscapes as well. From there, Peter ventured to Saudi Arabia, where he spent 60 days mostly exploring the mountainous desert landscape. Then he swapped the dry desert sand for the lush green and, let's face it, often muddy roads in northern Kenya. Again, inspired to take the road less travelled, Peter left the tourist route far behind him and headed well off the beaten path. His African bike adventure would ultimately finish up with Tanzania, a place that Peter actually once called home so many years ago. Revisiting familiar sites was certainly part of this experience, but he also took full advantage of the wide tyres on his new touring bike, which allowed him to explore new areas and follow a much more challenging route through the country. I cannot wait to chat with Peter today and get right into the details of this big, grand 7-month adventure. So settle in, listeners, as we get ready for the huge hit of wanderlust that no doubt is about to follow. Peter Gostelow, a big warm welcome back to the show.
Hey, Bella, thanks for having me back. That's a great introduction. Yeah, thank you.
I had to stop myself when I was actually thinking about interviewing again, Peter, because my goodness, like even just listing all that out, it feels like you've done so much in what doesn't feel like such a long time ago.
No, it doesn't seem that long ago, but in another way it does, because Jordan, yeah, it feels like a long time ago, but this was just after we spoke last year.
Literally about to head on the plane that day to then take off. But Peter, I've already asked you about your very first bicycle, so I'm going to ask you something a little bit different. And that is, Peter Gostelow, do you remember the very first touring bike you ever rode?
I can, yeah. It wasn't for me a touring bike, but I did use it for my first ever, I guess, long bike journey. I used it when I was, I think 14 or 15. I did what's called a Duke of Edinburgh scheme here in the UK. And that bicycle was a Ridgeback. It was a bright red Ridgeback. I really loved that bicycle. I never bought it at that age, or I think it was a Christmas present, thinking that I would use it as a touring bike. But I did the Duke of Edinburgh award on it. But then several years later, that bicycle sadly got stolen from A supermarket, yeah. When I was at university, and I was absolutely gutted. I remember coming outside and just seeing the lock. I mean, it's a sight that is probably one of the worst sort of sights that any cyclist has to experience, finding that their bike has been stolen. Such a long time ago, but I remember it quite vividly. And yeah, I was absolutely gutted that that bike was stolen. But that was my first kind of touring bike.
It always makes me sad. I don't know if you feel the same. Like, when you're sometimes in a city and you see the bike racks and you see just like a back wheel that's locked where someone hasn't locked their bike through their frame and the whole bike's been taken or something like that. It always makes me really sad. But it is actually a question which I get asked a lot by listeners of the show, and that is keeping your bike secure when you're on tour. I mean, who better to ask than someone who's toured so long yourself? Granted, Peter, you enjoy taking the road less travelled, and busy populous cities aren't necessarily places you seek to go, although you do go there. What do you do for bike security?
Yeah, it completely depends where I am. I think like bike theft is a much greater risk in many parts of Europe than it is in places like Saudi Arabia or actually a lot of Africa that I've cycled through. A lot of the time I'm touring by myself. So that is one of the disadvantages that, you can't have anybody else watching over your bike. When I do go into like bigger shops or supermarkets where the bike is out of sight, I lock it, obviously, and I minimize the time that I'm in the shop. I also, when I like get off the bike and lock it up, even here, every time, I always do like a 5 or a 10 second kind of look around at the car park and just see who's in there and has anybody seen me locking my bike. I do that like naturally every time, but I always minimize the time that I leave it locked. And the lock that I do have is when I'm touring is not actually a heavy duty lock. It's more of a deterrent. It's just a simple cable lock because I think that most of the time when people will see a bike that's locked, unless it's their absolute intention to steal it, in which case they've come with something like wire cutters, they will leave it. A lot of bike thefts, like opportunists, where I think bikes have just been left unlocked very quickly or for a short time and then they're taken. But, if I was cycling in big cities, I wouldn't leave, my bike actually locked outside for more than a few minutes. And so I think the bikes that you talk about where you just see the wheel is remaining, it's possible that some of these bikes have been left there longer. But yeah, I see these awful, YouTube videos where guys come along with axe grinders or whatever and basically saw through like really heavy duty locks. It's very difficult to actually like ensure that your bike is going to be safe.
It's sort of more a deterrent often than anything.
Mm.
A fully fledged bike thief is now, especially in cities, armed with angle grinders, battery operated. They're going to cut through the heaviest duty lock in no time. What about wild camping and security of your items there? Is there an element of who knows that you're there in the first place and how visible you are? Are you leaving your bike outside? Do you bring it into like the vestibule of your tent? Like, how are you dealing with stuff there?
No, I'd say that 90% or 95% of the places that I choose to wild camp are generally so far away from places that I would expect anybody to come to that I don't even always lock it outside my tent. If I have any sense, I mean, I should just do it out of habit. And a lot of the time, I do lock my bike just to itself because a lot of the time there's nothing to actually lock it to. There are very few times where I'm getting inside my tent really worried about my bike outside because I wouldn't choose to camp in such locations like that. So if I take an example anywhere really, whether it's in Africa or the UK, usually I'm camping in places that I just what I perceive as being safe to leave my bike outside and I'll lock it, but I don't always do it. And no, so I'm not doing things like bringing my bike inside. Occasionally, a few times I have in the past, probably like tied with a bungee cord or something, my wheel to the tent pole just because. there was something about where I was which just didn't make me feel particularly safe. But that's very rare.
I think also it's testament to where you're choosing to travel to now as well. I mentioned in my introduction, Peter, it wasn't that long that we spoke for that first episode, but I feel you've crammed so much in and you've seen so many places. And yet, even saying it that way does a disservice to the way you travel because I don't feel you're someone who rushes through a place. And I'm not talking about point to point distances here. From the insights I gather from what you post online and what you share in your blogs and your photos, you are really exploring a region. You're not sort of giving it just a very small touch to see, opening the curtains and seeing what it looks like outside. With this adventure of yours, I want to know you left the UK knowing you were going to do the Jordan Bike Trail. Was 60 days in Saudi on the cards at that stage? And then looking further beyond that, had you thought once I leave Saudi, I'm going to actually go to Kenya and Tanzania? Like, I want to sort of know, how does a long-term bike traveler like yourself come up with the ideas of how long you're going to be traveling for and where you're going?
Uh, Good question. So the Jordan Bike Trail took me about 3 weeks, and that was also including like days off and rest days. When I arrived in Saudi, I think my initial plan was actually just to cycle the northern part and get to Jeddah, and then to fly or take a bus from Jeddah. I never actually planned to go right down to the far south, but within probably a week of cycling through northern Saudi, I was kind of enjoying it so much that I thought, well, I don't actually. There was no reason for me to like finish in Jeddah, and I didn't actually particularly want to cycle. I mean, Jeddah's a massive city on the coast. I didn't actually want to cycle there. Cycling into big cities anywhere, especially somewhere like Saudi, is not enjoyable. So I had no reason to go to Jeddah. And then as the days went by, I just thought, I don't actually have any reason not to continue going further south. My visa was valid for 3 months. It was the right time of year. The weather was perfect. The camping was fantastic. The hospitality and the people were amazing. So I just continued. And as the weeks went by, I realized that I was going to have to, because my brother was living in Qatar at the time, and it was always the plan to visit. And I don't like flying with the bike at all, so I realized it would have been quite easy to just put the bike on a bus, because also Saudi itself, the most interesting part to ride is really the west, because there's a chain of mountains which run from north to south. The center of the country is predominantly desert, and a lot of it is just flat. And having lived there before, I wasn't really attracted to cycling through the center of Saudi. So it was quite easy to take a bus for 1,200 kilometers from the south and just go straight through Saudi to get to the east coast and then ride into Qatar. But by that time, I'd already had in my mind that I wanted to go back to East Africa. So this was sort of February, March time. And I was looking at going back to the UK in the summer. There were some things going on here. My mum was moving house, and I wanted to come back to help with that. And I'd also lined up some teaching work. So I gave myself about 3 months, and that just tied in well with the 90-day visa for Kenya. And so it was quite easy to fly from Qatar to Nairobi and then go into Tanzania that way. Although I wish I'd had a bit more time in Tanzania, because I ended up spending almost 2 months just in Kenya. So time does pass quickly when you're on the road sometimes.
It's interesting also just thinking, as I mentioned, you lived in Tanzania, so
Yeah.
and you've done big tours through Africa as well. You also lived in Saudi and worked there for many years as well. Although, from what I gather, life in Saudi as opposed to touring there on a bike in this recent trip were very, very polar apart, right?
Yeah, completely different. I lived there for 5 years, and I did visit the western part, but I was living in the east, which is like a long way away, and the landscapes around there were not really inspiring or interesting to cycle through. The sort of flat, monotonous desert landscapes, and I really wished I had been in the west, but I wasn't. I was working in the eastern province, and I was living on a compound which was like a holiday resort. Really, it was very secure. Everything was kind of provided by the company. It was very comfortable, but I didn't really feel in some ways that I was actually connected to Saudi at all. I was teaching Saudis, but then when I came home to where I lived, it was all very kind of sterile and artificial. It was a very easy and relaxing life in some ways, but I wasn't really doing many adventures. And so I'd always looked at coming back to Saudi and exploring more of the country, especially the West. And like a lot of countries, you have a kind of time window to do it, and it's really too hot to do it in the summer months. So that whole region is really best explored from sort of November to March or April. The rest of the year, I mean, some people do sort of travel in the summer, but you're cycling then in sort of 40, 45 degree temperatures, and that's just not appealing. So it was the right time of year to go back. And I had been looking at going back a year or two before, but it actually had only opened up, I think, the previous year because of COVID restrictions. And going back before that, the country really actually opened itself up to Western tourists, I think in 2019. So people who are going there now are still experiencing a country which hasn't really opened itself up in the same way that many others have around there.
Saudi is a country that this podcast has taught me so much about, because I put my hand up unashamedly as saying really all I know about Saudi Arabia is what I've seen in my Western media mind. I know about a government there that has questionable, I guess, rules in place for its citizens. And as a woman as well, and this is prior to speaking to guests who've travelled there, my own thoughts of being in Saudi Arabia are very clouded by that. Something I've noticed when you post about your time there is you're very cognizant of posting about your experiences as a male traveling solo through Saudi. And I have definitely interviewed female travelers who traveled through Saudi, and all of them have had a very safe experience. And I don't know whether it's still that judgment that clouds me personally, Peter, but something that had struck me is I think you'd mentioned somewhere where you hadn't really seen many women in Saudi. You knew this would be the case, and you knew that the first woman you had an interaction with would be a Western woman. And I think it was a lady who's motorbike touring at the moment.
Yeah, Helen, she used to do a lot of bike touring, but she's doing a lot more on a motorbike. So yeah, she was exploring, that whole area by motorbike. So her experience was different to mine, and just like any other single female traveling there would be different to mine.
It has been the question that's still in the back of my mind as a solo woman traveling through Saudi. What would that be like? And I've interviewed, like, I think of Steph Devery, I think of Helen Dainty, High Hells, and I think they both sort of travelled again on the coast and the more populated highway route potentially. And then I think of Laura McMillan, who's travelled through Saudi with her partner Ali Denham, and of course travelling as a couple, so it's a vastly different experience as well. And I just
Mm.
haven't. I still wonder what would it be like for me as a woman. I feel I would be safe there from what my guests have told me, but I don't know how I would feel being in a country where a lot of women I'm not sort of seeing.
Yeah, and I think it's completely understandable and sensible to be thinking those things. I mean, it's definitely a lot easier just being a man there. All of the sort of routes that I took and the kind of places that I camped. Saudi for camping is completely safe as for a guy. For me camping in the middle of nowhere, and then somebody will come and find me, and they did on a number of occasions. And it's very difficult for me to say or understand how that might feel as like a woman camping solo, because, well, I mean, that's just making me think of one instance where actually a guy, I think he'd got the wrong message. I don't know if you remember this. I remember.
Yes.
So the story there, which is kind of funny, but it's quite serious. But we'd been WhatsApping. I had met this guy who had pulled up alongside me on a rough track. We were just doing the Google Translate, like where I was going, etc., etc. We'd exchange numbers because often I'd do that as a sort of way to sort of like say, well, let's keep in touch. Even if I've just met somebody. So actually, as a guy, that's another thing. I don't care too much about giving my number out, which I'm sure many single women would do. But I'd given him my number, And then a few hours later, he WhatsApped me. He was trying to call me on WhatsApp and I was ignoring it. And then I got to where I was camping and I was trying to find my pillow, my camping pillow, and I couldn't find it. And I realized it must have dropped out of my bag because one of my bags, the fork bags on the front, was a bit open. And when I opened up my WhatsApp, I saw he had sent a picture of this pillow. So he'd been trying to call me to say that he'd found it. And obviously, he'd very close to where we'd met. So then I gave him my location. And, in reply to him saying, I can come and bring it to you, rather than me just saying, that would be great and giving him a thumbs up, I was using the heart emoji. And I kept using this heart emoji because I think sometimes people just use it as a way to sort of say thank you.
I certainly do.
Yeah, exactly. And then he'd obviously got the wrong message because then his messages to me, I was camping at this point. It was dark. It was about 8 or 9 o'clock. He said he was going to come to my tent later. I'd given him my location. And then he was saying things which were slightly, well, actually, it was quite obvious that he had other intentions because he was talking about giving me a massage. And I can't remember what else exactly, but I just remember actually being beside my tent and I was trying to tell him, don't worry, don't come this evening. I will pick it up tomorrow. And I remember messaging people at the time and they were like, pack up and get out of there. And I was like, I'm in the middle of nowhere. It's pitch dark. It'll be fine. Well, he did turn up at like 10 o'clock and I'd given him the location. These lights were coming towards me in the dark, and he got out, and I was sitting by a campfire. I'd made a campfire, and he sort of sat down beside me and put his hand on my leg, and I basically said straight away, "Look, thanks for the pillow, but basically nothing's happening here." And he got the message pretty quickly. And he got back in the car, and I think he felt embarrassed, and then drove off. Now, as a guy, he was by himself, and if he tried to be more physical, I would have, responded accordingly. But how would that have been as a single woman? I don't know whether a woman would have put herself in that position by giving a guy her number and also the location of where she was. So there are things that I do like much more freely traveling solo in that kind of context than I think many women would do.
It's interesting because I've also had it said to me on the flip side where sometimes it's an advantage to travel as a woman in these countries because you get taken into the household and you actually get to see the women then, which as a man you don't get to do. And so you get to see different sides of a culture. And also sometimes as a woman it can be an advantage because that does happen. And there's also this perception that other people need to protect you because you are a woman. And whether that's right or not, I don't really want to get into, but it's still something that strikes me about Saudi there. And I say that almost with a bit of sadness because I look at where my guests like yourself, Peter, have been and the images they share of Saudi and their experiences overwhelmingly of a beautiful, hospitable country. It's not the only country in the world that has a questionable government in charge.
Yeah.
And it's not right to judge a country by its government necessarily either. But yeah, it's still been one of those questions I have in the back of my mind about.
And I don't think it's just Saudi. Yeah,
I do actually want to wind back though.
okay.
And I want to talk about something that changed this trip compared to your previous trips, and that's really about your equipment.
Okay.
I'm not a podcast that talks about equipment often, but the reason I'm bringing it up is because I feel like your change in equipment allowed you to take on roads and routes that you previously would not have done.
Yes and no. I think, yeah, the bike that I'm riding now is definitely more equipped for riding off-road, although I've still cycled many rough tracks on bikes which aren't perhaps as well equipped. It's just really a question that it's probably not as comfortable in terms of having like narrower tires and the sort of geometry of the bike, but it also in terms of luggage. I mean, if I go all the way back to the first trip that I made, yeah, the things that I was carrying, I wouldn't carry now, whether it be like paperback books or a pair of jeans or things which basically I often have the sort of conversation with people when we talk about weight. People can get a bit obsessed with like weighing things. Can weigh, I don't weigh my toothbrush, but sometimes I will weigh out of interest, and it's really interesting because I haven't really been posting on it, but this last few months I've been doing a lot of research on like a new tent, just because I had the time. And manufacturers will write down their weights and they'll say something like 1.5 kilos, and then when you get it and actually you weigh it all, it's that's completely wrong. But I do actually weigh like a lot of the equipment, but then sometimes I can get a bit carried away with with stuff. So I'm much more conscious of what I carry now, and I really question, do I need this? Because I think the more you travel, most people would realize that the less they actually really need. It kind of depends where you're going as well and the time of year, but what I'm trying to say is carrying less basically helps you in terms of the routes you take, because riding some of these off-road routes and climbing really steep mountainsides when you're only carrying, say, 10 kilos or 12 kilos of luggage compared to like 15 or 20. And I've met and I've cycled with people who just basically choose to take different roads because they're riding on a bike which has got 40 kilos or so of luggage. And it's their choice. I mean, and people, obviously, people can adapt that. They can decide to leave things behind. But there's always a tendency, I think, when you're packing, especially for a long journey, is to end up carrying too much because you think of all the things that you might need, but then there are lots of things that you can actually just pick up from the places you're actually going to. So, yeah, the logistics of packing and carrying things can be presented as being quite simple, as in just take less. But it's also important to prioritize and decide what you really need to take.
I want to know then, given that you do all of this and you've got so much experience and you're obviously leaving your pair of jeans behind, what is your piece of luxury item that you realistically could probably do without, but you wouldn't want to?
Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, I'm definitely not ultra light. I mean, I carry a camping chair. That would not be seen as being ultralight. On previous trips recently, I've carried like a coffee mocha pot or a kettle. That's not considered as ultralight, although I do weigh them and I think, well, it's kind of justified. So everybody can make that own decision themselves whether carrying something which weighs X amount is justified. What else have I carried that's a luxury item? Um, I'd say that's about it, really. I mean, I carry a pillow, that doesn't weigh very much. Like an inflatable pillow is like 80 or 90 grams, but some people will be like, well, you can just use a dry bag with a down jacket inside it.
Funnily enough, I don't have that experience. My husband did. You know those any inflatable thing when the dimples in it sort of undimple?
Yeah, delaminate. Yeah, yeah, they do happen
He had
eventually.
that happen to him on his pillow. And so he used a dry sack with his down jacket and had a miserable night's sleep regardless. And there'll be people who do that every day and tell me it's amazing and it works. But yeah, no, I'm with you. I'd take the extra 90 grams. Your camping chair. Was it you, Peter, whose camping chair caught fire?
Yeah, yeah. So that's the Helinox one, the ultralight one. So basically,
How awesome are those chairs, by the
well,
way?
they are, but the one which is lighter, which is 500 grams, blows over with like, if you stand up and there's even like a light gust of wind, it will blow over. Whereas the other one, which is a kilo, is much sturdier and some people will say is more comfortable. It's slightly wider. But I'm fine in the lightweight one, but I'd stood up next to a campfire. I'd gone to get something from my tent and I could just smell something and I turned around and my chair was in the fire and I managed to rescue it. I got the material sewn back up a few days later, and yeah, I still have that chair and I carry it. I mean, other things that I carry which other tourists wouldn't do, like I do carry like a bigger. It's lighter, but I do carry a bigger camera tripod, and I carry a camera with a separate lens. I've just replaced my camera drone last year. Before I spoke to you, I lost a drone in Georgia. I've replaced that. So I do carry some like electronic gear, which, yeah, other people would consider as not necessary, but I do. So, yeah.
I guess ultimately, and you were hinting at that, and you were talking about a chair or a coffee. It's funny, like I take an AirPress coffee maker with me, and that's my bit of luxury. And I've only just recently this year upgraded. I have a Helinox chair, and it's given me the greatest joy to just not have to sit on the dirt at the end of every day.
Absolutely.
It's a bit of weight, but that's my bit of luxury. But what I was going to say is it's very personal, isn't it? Because it's also
Hmm.
what are you taking these trips for, and what are you seeking out there? A question which I have for you, Peter, is it was just one word. It's astrophotography, because your photography is something that really stood front and center for me when you took this recent journey, and the star shots and, the beautiful astrophotography you were taking there. And on the one hand, you could say exactly what you were saying. Oh, other people would think that's totally unnecessary. You don't need to have camera equipment with you to take a journey. But also, this is your journey and what you're taking from it. Photography is obviously a passion of yours,
Yeah.
obviously something you're seeking out to get energized by the act of doing it on your trip as well. So leaving it behind might save you a few kilos in your luggage, but maybe it leaves a big hole in your stomach because
Yeah.
because you have left it behind.
But there's also a lot of thought and research like goes into both the camera and what kind of lens you see. A year or two ago, I had a full frame camera, which was still quite compact, but then the lenses for it are like heavier. And I realized that I decided to sacrifice a little bit of image quality by getting this slightly smaller sensor in the camera. And the image quality is still great, but the reason that I chose a different camera was because of the logistics of like just carrying more gear. I mean, I know some people might carry several lenses or more, but I mean, I just carry. So the astrophotography that I took was mostly taken with like a prime lens, which is quite light. It's like 150 grams, but you can get high quality lenses which like weigh a kilo, and I just can't justify carrying like that much weight just for like camera equipment. But also, if you're taking astrophotography, you really need to have a tripod, and you could have a tripod which weighs a couple of kilos, but the one I have, which is just plastic, which is fine as long as it's not really windy, weighs like half a kilo. All of these things, they do add up. But trying to cut a couple of 100 grams here and then on other things, eventually you will end up saving a number of kilos, and ultimately it's like the extra kilos that you don't need to be carrying up the hills. But there's always like a trade-off, you see, and I've even realized that with the tents, and I knew this before. It's like if you go ultra light, often it's at the expense of like strength and durability. So an ultra light tent, which weighs like less than a kilo, is going to be ultralight for a reason, and it's because of the materials that they've used are just not as thick or as strong. So with something like a tent, then you have to decide, well, actually, it's more justifiable to like carry these extra 100 grams because I'm using my tent a lot, and so it's better that I find that this kind of balance between having something which is both still light but it ticks the box of like being durable. So one of the tents that I bought earlier on this summer was a big Agnes tiger wall or something. And the moment I put it up, the fly sheet was pretty much see through. And I just saw this thing as like not being that durable. So I just sent it back. Yeah. So I do spend quite a lot of time like looking at equipment and reading reviews. And then it's a bit of trial and error, really, deciding what works for you.
I want to take you back to your photography quickly. And I think we talked about this actually in the first episode as well. With that long journey, the changes that have happened since taking that journey almost 20 years ago to just technology advances. So you're not taking paperback books, you've got a Kindle with you, for example, or you're not writing a journal so much because you're taking photos and different things as well. You initially were going to write a book, and I don't know if you made a start on it and then you sort of stopped. And then you also said, but the way you would write it now would be very different
Mm.
because you'd be reflecting back differently with different experiences. But do you also find, were you as much of a photographer in the early years as well, or has that sort of developed with this? And the reason I ask that, realize this is a long question, Peter, but the reason I ask that is when I was knowing I was interviewing again and I went on your fantastic website, and I'll put a link to it in the show notes, listeners. I encourage you to take a look at it because Peter has some great blogs of the countries that he's been to on there. And it became pretty clear quickly that the way that you now recall your experiences is a lot through your photos, and there's like a photographic story that's gone along with that. Is that a change from when you first set out, or is it more that we live in a time where technology allows us to show images more openly to people, and so it goes more than the written word so much?
Oh, yeah. So back in the beginning, I was doing a lot more writing. I was still taking photos. I mean, I was still very interested in photography in the beginning, but I was writing blogs. And I guess in more recent years, with the advent of Instagram and social media, everything from photos to shorter videos have just become like much more engaging for people to follow. I mean, I still do want to do more writing, but it's much more time consuming to write those blogs than it is to share the stories through photos, so the photos that I've used and put them up on stories, I can do that in seconds or minutes, whereas like writing some of the blogs, can take me hours or days because I want to make sure that I'm saying it in the way I want to. So it's all a bit more kind of consumable. The sort of social media, the short videos and the photos. But my interest in photography is just the same, really. I do still love taking photos, and I've done a lot more photography than I have like filming. I mean, a lot more. I don't have a YouTube channel. A lot of people focus more on like filming, and that's incredibly time consuming as well. Not just setting up your camera, but all of the editing. I realized just from taking some of these short videos that I have done with my phone, you can end up with hundreds of, well, not hundreds of hours, but you can end up with so much footage that it can take so long to edit it all down. And so, again, it's kind of this sort of trade off, deciding how much time am I spending editing and going through all of this footage compared to how much time I'm riding. And I think I try to find this balance, or I prefer just being out there doing the actual cycling rather than spending days and days just sitting at a desk trying to go through all of this footage. I have so many photos. I mean, I used to upload my photos onto a site called Flickr. I still have that, and I still plan to put some of the photos on there, and I haven't done that for the last year or two just because it's finding the time to do it all with everything else. So just get consumed, I think, by all of this sort of photos and videos that you take.
I want to know then also, do you plan to go to places because you obviously you want to experience them in the moment there front and center, but do you also plan to go to places because you have images in mind and you would like to be able to, with your passion as a photographer, actually practice your craft in photography and rediscover them that way as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think anybody is inspired to travel to places based on like imagery, whether it's like photos or video. So, if I look through photos of somebody, for example, cycling through, I don't know, Brazil, or and I don't see anything which looks striking. I mean, that's not necessary to say that there isn't anything interesting there, because obviously it also depends on the person who's documenting it. I mean, some people just don't choose to take photos from a place which there could be great images. But then there are other places where even if you were perhaps a bad photographer or not very good with not really interested in photography, you're still going to take great pictures because the landscapes are so amazing. So a friend of mine was in Norway a few months ago, and the pictures. I think anybody who travels in Norway, the videos and the photos you see, it looks absolutely stunning. So I would always be drawn to places that have that kind of imagery. But then other places, perhaps if the landscapes are quite monotonous and the towns don't have like much in the way of culture or history, and everything looks a little bit kind of bland, that's not necessarily to discredit the country or the place, but I would probably be less attracted to go there. And so, yeah, going to Saudi, I knew that Western Saudi, I knew the desert landscapes and the mountains, that it would be a great place for both photographing and all of the wild camping. So yeah, I am definitely like led towards places which are like visually stimulating from a photography aspect. Yeah.
obviously there's photos you take which are captivating because of those big grand landscapes, but there's also photos that you take which tell a totally different story, and it's not to do with landscapes. I think one of the images I came across, which was when you were in Kenya, and I can't remember exactly where you were in Kenya, but in it, it was a photo, I think, of your wild camp spot, or a view from your spot, and a young teenage pregnant woman had walked through the image.
Oh, yeah.
And it was sort of, you said it was really poignant because Kenya has had such a population explosion, and it was a real insight into that area. And you sort of talked about that then as well. And I sort of thought, that's clearly where an image really cuts through and tells that narrative as well.
Yeah, and I didn't actually plan that photo. I was actually, I mean, it was really spontaneous because I was taking a picture of the sunset, and she was probably only like 14 or 15, and she was quite heavily pregnant. She just walked in front of me, and it was almost like a silhouette of her, pregnant stomach with the sun behind. And I remember arriving. This was in Lake northern Kenya, Lake Turkana, arriving in this really small, not even a village, it was just sort of like a fishing community on the side of the lake. I'd say the average age of the people there was probably about 15 because it was just kids everywhere. There is, in that kind of context, high birth rate, and the fact that there was this teenage pregnancy was probably indicative of the population there, lack of education and resources. So it was quite sad, but quite moving as well. And I've seen that in lots of other parts of Africa. So that stands out.
Yeah, and again, it's where an image really tells that narrative more evocatively, sometimes more than the written word would as well. There's other times where an image really takes me to a scene too. Again, I think this was also in Kenya, and it was just a photo of your foot absolutely covered in mud with your sandal, and you were like, the sandals is the only way to go when you're cycling through Africa. But it really took me through through what it would have been on that day. You did definitely experience Kenya in, well, it was rainy season, but it was an exceptionally wet rainy season as well. So I imagine there were lots of muddy dirt roads for you to navigate too.
Yeah, there'd been a lot of rain, and I was quite fortunate because I was actually cycling further north away from where most of the rains were, but there still had been some heavy rains. So the landscapes were like much greener than I imagined them to be, apart from in the far north of Kenya where it hardly ever rains at all. But there were some stretches where, yeah, there were muddy roads, but they weren't as muddy as my experiences of being in other parts of Africa. That's just because northern Kenya really doesn't receive as much rainfall as further south or in the center. But yeah, comparing that to Saudi, I think during the 2 months I was there, it rained for about 5 minutes. And the country can get like freak weather and heavy rain, just like lots of places can. But yeah, climatically, really quite different in general.
It's interesting actually, because something else that I came across, and it made me reflect quite poignantly, was about the topic of water. And water is obviously something that a bike traveler thinks about, especially in the countries that you're traveling to. Something that you had said was, Turkana is hot and dry, and water is scarcely found in places. My water bladder was now getting used daily.
Mm.
A water filter would have been useful in this part of Kenya. And the reason I really reflected on that was, and you talk about water constantly about your trip in Kenya and in Tanzania, but it made me sort of think back to Saudi, because Saudi, again, is a place where I think it's a desert. There's no water, there's no rain, it's really dry. And I don't know why it was remiss of me, but it seemed to be that you came across water easier in Saudi than you did
Yeah,
necessarily in Kenya or Tanzania.
absolutely. I mean, most of the water in Saudi is desalinated. So you have these like enormous desalination plants, and there's a whole industry and infrastructure around water being transported, to mosques, thousands of mosques around the country. So even though the climate was really dry, finding water in Saudi was never a problem. And in actual fact, I don't think there was a day that I was in Saudi where somebody didn't stop in their car and give me water. whether I needed it or not. So I ended up carrying like a lot of water sometimes, and I didn't need the water bladder. Actually, I took the water bladder later because I knew that in northern Kenya, I remember I'd been in northern Kenya before, and I remember having a water bladder, and Turkana is particularly dry, and there are big distances between places. So yeah, I was carrying like 10 liters of water. Well, in actual fact, there was one day or 2 days where I was carrying about 13 liters because I knew that I wasn't going to find any fresh water. But that was never the case in Saudi Arabia.
Wow, I was just thinking, you know how we were talking before about your equipment and whether this tripod weighs 500 grams, this one weighs a kilo, and then all of a sudden 13 liters of water, there's 13 kilos you didn't have before.
Yeah, that's a crazy thing, really. I mean, I sometimes think of the times where I talk about like weighing everything and then could be carrying like 3 or 4 liters of water and carrying it up like a massive mountain. And then I get to the top and there's like fresh water there. And I think like I've just carried like four kilos up this mountain for no reason. But I don't think you can ever like sacrifice on water. It's like, it's the key thing really, to be low on water or not have enough water. So I'd always rather like have more and be carrying it than less, especially like when I'm going off to camp. I always want to make sure that I've got at least 3 liters of water or more if the next day, or 3 or 4 liters if the next day I'm not going to be able to find it easily. So it really depends where I am, but yeah, you can't really save weight on carrying like lighter water because water is water. So
I'm imagining you've had experiences of running out of water. And I'm not just this trip. I don't know whether that happened on this trip, but in previous trips, have you had grim experiences?
yeah, but ironically, it's usually in places where it's been so easily available that I've just not given it a second thought, and I've like cycled out of a village with like half a liter of water, and then I've looked at my map, and I'm like, well, actually, there isn't anything for another like 30 or 40 kilometers, and I'm going to camp. So then I've had to go back to get water. I think that happened in Italy one time, but then it was also because it was really hot. So yeah, I mean, I always try to make sure that I've got extra water. And I think as time has gone on, it's always something that I would check, especially towards like later in the day, like if I'm going to camp and I know that I'm not going probably not going to find water.
Hey, awesome listeners! Are you loving what you're hearing on Seek Travel Ride? Do you want to keep the good vibes rolling? Then head over to our Buy Me a Coffee page and show your support for the podcast. Just a little virtual caffeine love can keep me brewing up the content which you adore. Click the link in the show notes, buy me a virtual coffee, and let's keep this podcast party going. Thanks, legends! Now back to the episode.
The water bladder you were talking about, is that something that you would bring on every trip? Or it depends on where you're traveling to? Like,
Hardly ever. I mean, well, not hardly ever. It really depends. I mean, in Europe, no. In Saudi, I didn't need it. Most of Africa, well, parts of Africa. I mean, it also depends if you're doing a lot of camping. Like the water bladder is quite it's quite useful to use it as a shower. So at the end of the day, whether you're carrying like a 4 or a 6, or I even before had like a 10 liter bladder, but I wouldn't be carrying that for very long. I'd fill it up later in the day before camping. But definitely for Europe, not necessary. But I mean, the water bladder itself, when it's empty, it doesn't weigh very much, so it can be easily like packed up and put in the bottom of a pannier if you need to use it.
what about Jordan for water? What was it like for water?
Again, like Saudi, so I don't think there's any everywhere in like the Arab Peninsula. So whether it's like Saudi or Oman, wherever there's a mosque, a functioning mosque, there will be water. And small villages would have mosques and they would have water. So it was never really that much of an issue finding water in these places. And as I said, in Saudi, a lot of it's desalinated. It would be like transported by trucks. So yeah, I never worried quite as much in those places than I would for example, like in Kenya, I had to fill up water from Lake Turkana, which I did drink it after I boiled it, and it was okay. But as I think I'd said at the time, it was somewhere that I should, or I wished I'd had a water filter. But most of the rest of the trip, I didn't really feel that I needed one.
And Lake Turkana is a saline lake too, isn't it? Like it.
It is saline.
I didn't realize you could just boil salty water and it would be fine to drink.
No, I mean it's saline, but it's not like seawater. So it just tastes slightly like not how it should do. So I used it to cook with. I used it to boil and drink tea. But I only did that for a couple of days. It was fine, but the rest of the time, I was able to find water.
I want to take you back to Jordan and the Jordan Bike Trail because this was a route that's been mapped out. I think it's available on bikepacking.com.
Yeah.
I want to ask firstly, have you done these sort of things before where you've seen like a fully mapped out route of a country and you've decided I'm going to do that? Or was this the first instance of that type of bike travel?
I haven't done that many of the like following routes. I tend to look at them and use them sometimes as like a rough idea. I mean, the Jordan Bike Trail, I'd cycled in Jordan before, and you could create your own. And I usually do like just create my own, but sometimes when something's already been established there, you can just have it there. And then, actually, none of these routes I ever follow them 100% because there's always times where it's like, well, actually, I'm going to take this track because I need to go to that town to get some supplies, or you look on the map and you're like, well, it makes no sense to. So I sometimes think, when those routes have been created, they haven't always been, how to say, like revised, because you could be cycling along a track and the GPS is telling you to take a right and take a different track. But if you carried on going straight, this track will reconnect with it like in half a kilometer. And then you're thinking, why is this track like veered off? And I've done it a few times thinking that there must be some reason. And I think it's just because the person who's actually created it was just trying to find something and then came back. So I don't always follow it. I used it as a sort of rough route, but nothing like that existed in Saudi. So route planning in Saudi was a bit more of a challenge, really, because there isn't big road network there, but there are off-road tracks, which some of which are marked on like Google Maps, but others aren't. And so I had to use Google Satellite some of the time to really see whether I could actually take a track. And there were a few times where I wasn't 100% sure, but then when you look on Google Satellite, if you see something like a building on a track, then you know that there must have been transport that was able to transport building materials to get there. But it's not always possible to know, obviously, what the track will be like, because if it's deep sand, that's not going to be possible. But most of the time in Saudi, the desert where I was not deep sand. It was more sort of stony like rocks and desert, which were absolutely fine to ride over.
I want to know then about a track you took in Saudi that or one of those, I see it on Google Satellite, there should be something here. And I just have this image where it can go one of two ways. It will either, yep, I've nailed it, this is
Mm.
fantastic, or it can be, well, I've given myself a sense of route mapping misadventure today. I want to know about the latter.
Well, I think it's like being sensible. So, if you see like a track and the track is going off for, let's just say, 30 or 40 kilometers and it's connecting with the paved road, that's okay. But if it's a track which is going like a very, very long way, it's going to take you more than a day or 2 days. And then you're thinking, well, actually, even if I carry like so much water, I'm going to run out of water. There's nothing along this track. If something goes wrong, I'm absolutely screwed. So I would probably make the decision not to take that kind of track unless somebody had told me, oh yeah, there's something along the way where you can fill up with water. Because I won't do that by myself because it's just being sensible. So there was one of those tracks in Saudi. I'd really wish, well, I don't wish I could have taken it, because I was actually going around the desert to the other end of where this track would connect. And it was probably only about 60 or 70 kilometers, but it just seemed like too far to go. And if there'd been some problem along there, and I'd run out of water, then I would have had a big problem. So yeah, just being sensible. But other times it's like, well, okay, I've got 5 liters of water. If this track happens to be like really rough and just not possible, then I can always just come back. So yeah.
I guess it's you taking an assessment of what your situation is on that day. What have you got already with you? And that changes what the outcome could be. I get there, there's no water, but it doesn't matter because I have water with me already. Or I get there, there's no water, I don't have water, I've got to go back. On the thought of having to go back, are you the sort of person, Peter, that takes, I guess, side routes, as in you might have a logical track that you're following in a certain direction, but will you go take side quests, or, go and do an out and back off that to go and see something? Or do you always try and make a route that doesn't involve having to go back on yourself?
No, well, I don't like doing out and backs. I mean, it depends what you're cycling out to. I mean, sometimes I remember like following a track because there's a waterfall or something, and it could be like actually this was like completely not worth like 2 or 3 hours. But then other times it was like, yeah, it was definitely worth coming to see. But then, there are other times like monasteries, which can be like on the top of a hill and you can see the monastery from the bottom in the distance. And you think, well, can I be bothered? Can I be bothered to climb 500 or 600 meters to get up there when I've already seen like a dozen monasteries? So I will take side routes, but again, I won't do all of them because it depends what I'm taking that side route for. I mean, when I met, talking about being on a bicycle compared to say like a motorbike. So my friend Helen, who's done a lot of both bike and motorbike trips, where we met in Saudi, it just reminded me of how much easier or how much harder it is on a bicycle because we were climbing a mountain which was basically 2,000 meters of elevation, and it took me the entire day. She went all the way up to the top in, an hour or so and then came back down and went back up and she was just sitting down on the roadside like no, I was completely pouring in with sweat. But yeah, I still felt that, doing it on the bicycle had more of a reward. So
Yeah, you earned the views.
yeah,
Every time you're on a mountain, that's what you tell yourself. It also is a reason to stop and take the view in sometimes as well, right?
absolutely. Yeah.
Actually, on that, and this probably happened in Saudi, definitely happened in Jordan, where it's not just necessarily the fact that you're climbing a mountain for hours, but you're climbing on steep roads. Like the Jordan Bike Trail has a reputation for some very steep gradients. And I remember this playing out and I'm not talking steep gradients that we're talking over 10%. I'm talking up into 20% figures here as well, like where it's just ridiculously steep.
Yeah. Yeah. There are some very steep sections.
Did you just take that as a matter of course, I'm in this very mountainous region and I'm going to be on very steep roads, and so it's a mental reset? Or like you're not put off by them? I think you had some hiker bike sections as well when it got steep. How do you prepare yourself mentally for taking on roads like that, and how do you take it on board?
Well, yeah, the really steep sections you can sometimes see ahead. Okay, I'm walking this, whether it's paved or unpaved, and you're like, okay, that's it. And sometimes like hiking it for a few hundred meters is just nicer anyway because you're looking up perhaps, and rather than crunching down on the pedals. Both Jordan and Saudi, there were some roads which had some really steep sections. I think there was one in Saudi which actually everywhere I've cycled had the steepest, but I thought it was the steepest going up. But when I came down the other side, it was actually steeper, and I don't think I would have been able to even push the bike up. It was basically 1,000 meter elevation or 1,000 meter descent in just over 5 kilometers, and
Oh, no.
yeah, it was ridiculous. It was so dangerous. I couldn't go down it. I had to come off and walk the bike down in sections because it was just some parts were like over 30%.
Oh, my goodness.
Those parts, yeah, there are some sections where if it's so very steep, it could take you a couple of hours just to do like 1 or 2 kilometers. But usually the really steep sections are like short. You might get a couple of 100 meters of something really steep, and then it will it will kind of not flatten out, but it will be rideable, and then it'll be steep again. And then you get dramatic views. But talking about Saudi specifically, you've got this like ridge of mountains, and so you've got a difference between like almost sea level, well, sort of 200 or 300 meters above sea level, and then you've got these like Sarawak mountains, which are between 2 and 3,000 meters. You're either cycling up in the mountains at that elevation, or you're down at lowland. You're not going to keep going up and down like every few days because this is way too much. I climbed up, and then it actually got quite cold and it was cloudy and there was some rain in the clouds. And I was like, I'm going to go down. So I went down like 2,000 meters. And then after a few days, I was like, actually, this is really hot. So then I climbed back up. But I was like, I'm not going back down again because it was just a lot of effort just to come all the way back up. And then I stayed at sort of 2,000 meters for the next week or two. So yeah, those big drops in elevation, I'm only going to do it once or twice. I'm not going to just like crazy like climb up 2,000 meters, then the next day go down, and then the next day climb back up because yeah, it's just I'm not doing that on a loaded bike.
It wasn't like the roads were always paved either. Like there were dirt roads involved in this too,
Yeah,
which you've got to really balance yourself for that type of climbing on a dirt road as well with those type of steep gradients.
yeah. I mean, Saudi did have dirt tracks, but I mean, I think a lot of it also there was paved parts. I mean, a lot of the off-road riding I did in Saudi, more of it was connected with riding off the road for somewhere to camp. So I could be like riding off-road for like 2, 3 kilometers along a wadi and then camping, and then I might come back to a paved road. So it wasn't like continuous off road all the time. And I think when I think back, most of the steeper roads that I climbed there were paved. There weren't so many that were unpaved. Most of the off road stuff I was doing there was like going through like dry riverbeds, like finding a way to camp or just connecting from one road to another. And so most of the time, I wasn't off the bike pushing up like crazy steep tracks.
You know, when you were talking about steep descents and how sometimes they were so steep you had to walk it down. You had the challenge, I think it was in Jordan, I don't think it was in Saudi, where your brake pads had totally worn out.
Yeah, well, what happened was the rear disc rotor, I didn't realize it straight away, but I was carrying my bike over a rock and I hit the disc rotor. And it wasn't until the next morning where I realized that my back wheel was was not spinning very well. So I managed to like straighten the rotor out so that the wheel was spinning a bit more freely, but I couldn't do it entirely until a week or two later, by which point the rear disc pads had completely worn down. So then I was just relying on the front brake, and the disc brakes that I were using, the pads were there were so many different kinds of disc brake pads, but the ones that I needed were not available in Jordan. So I had to order some to be sent to a town in northern Saudi, but I wasn't going to get there for a few weeks. So then I was just relying on the front brake, which was kind of okay, but I had to just be a bit more careful, especially like going down some of the hills because just having one brake because I could still use the rear brake, but it was basically like metal on metal. And actually, just last week, I replaced the disc rotor because I realized that the rear rotor it was below the minimum width. It was getting quite thin, so I've just swapped it out. But yeah, having one brake was obviously not ideal, so I had to be a bit careful to begin with.
Oh, I can just imagine. I think I don't know if I've told you, Peter, but I've certainly told other guests and listeners. You certainly know I have a bit of a anxious fear of descending. And actually, I must say, I have experience of descending with not much of a brake pad because I use my brakes quite a lot. So I
Yeah,
know that metal on metal that you're talking about because inadvertently there have been times where I haven't changed my brake pads as often as I should. And you go to change them and you go, wow, there really wasn't anything there.
yeah. It was a few years ago in Spain, actually. It was when I think back to it, it was so scary. I was coming down a hill. I think, yeah, one of the brakes had worn down really badly, and then the front brake, I think it was basically the cable just came through. So I was basically didn't have brakes, and I was going down what was quite a steep road, and I couldn't brake. I was trying to use my feet to skid along the road. I thought I was just literally going to take the bike off the road and then jump off it, but very fortunately the road just went round like a wide corner and then like it climbed up 50 meters, which brought me to a stop. Otherwise, I was just panicking, thinking I'm going to have to jump off the bike here.
Could I just say, just an insight into how my anxious mind works? Every now and then, when I'm coming down a descent here, down a Pyrenean mountain, which, let's face it, the descents can go for quite a while and can be steep in places, I'll stupidly just have the anxious thought of, what happens if both your brakes fail now? And I actually have those morbid thoughts of, I guess you'd slowly try to ride into that ditch, or, where
Yeah,
would you try and bin it?
I don't like speed. I mean, I don't like going downhill fast. Usually I won't go downhill faster than like 40 to 50 kilometers an hour. I sometimes see people saying, "Oh yeah, I got my fastest speed of like 75 kilometers," and I'm like, I will never go on a loaded bike, or even not on a loaded bike. I wouldn't go that kind of speed. I generally just go like I'm more cautious with how I ride.
40 to 50 feels fast to me now. I am getting to do that. Actually, shout out to Redshift Sports who have supported the show. And listeners, they did give me some of their equipment to use, which I'm really thankful for. But what I will say is a consequence of their suspension stem, which I never realized would be a thing, was just how much difference it's made in my headspace for descending, because the road feels smoother now when I'm descending.
Right.
And I'm guessing in my mind, I feel like I'm in more control, which means I'm not as fearful and hence enjoying the descents a bit more. So just recently I've noticed I am allowing myself to go back to 50 kilometers an hour down a descent, which I must say for the last 12 months was definitely not a thing for me. So yeah, that was a pretty cool thing to discover. I was pretty happy with that. It's amazing how, though everyone talks about marginal gains, but it's the headspace gains sometimes that matter as well, isn't
Yeah,
it?
absolutely. Absolutely.
You've done such extensive travel like through Africa, you've lived in Africa, you lived in Saudi, and this tour took you back to places that you had visited previously. You're obviously not someone who's adverse to going back to familiar places.
No, not at all. I like going back to places that I've either traveled through before and enjoyed, or places that I've lived in before. I mean, with Tanzania, I can speak like conversational Swahili, so that makes a big difference. I can't speak much Arabic, but going back to Saudi, I wanted to go back because I saw that it would be worthwhile for me to go. So I'm not so bothered about sort of tick boxing like new countries all the time. I mean, it's always nice to go to new locations, but if I've cycled through a country before and I enjoyed different aspects of it, and there's still much more in that country to explore, like different roads or different islands, then I quite like going back to sort of like I like the sort of feeling of sort of familiarity in a way, and just exploring more of a country that I've been to before, rather than perhaps going somewhere new just because I haven't been there before, but doing it only because I haven't been there before, and then realizing, well, actually, it wasn't that great. And I mean, I don't know. I mean, I'm happy to go to all like new places, but at the same time, I'm quite happy to go back to places I've been to before. And there are some countries which I'm not really that interested to revisit on the bicycle, because just memories of traveling there before didn't have like strong reasons for me to like want to go back. There aren't many of them. I'm never that excited to go back to, say, Vietnam, but I think I was so much younger then. I just found it really busy, and I don't know. But most of the places I would go back to, I sometimes say I wouldn't go back to China, but China's so big that there are parts of China I'd definitely go back to. So there aren't many countries that I wouldn't go back to. But some of the countries that I have been to before are quite difficult to go back to, like Syria, and you can travel in Pakistan, but yeah, I went through Libya. I wouldn't necessarily go back to Libya. I mean, I crossed the north of the country. Most of the country is just big desert, and there isn't really anything there that I would go back to. But there's lots of like security issues in places now that make it like less easy, or more dangerous perhaps to go back to.
With that idea of not being put off going back to places you'd been to before, there's also, you know how you went to Tanzania, you'd lived there before.
Mm.
Obviously, you were going to go to places that you had a lot of memories about. Was there that nostalgic element, like when you were back, like going back in time? I know that you, for example, you took photos from exactly the same spot. I was here in, whatever, and now here it is. But it must be amazing to be able to reflect back on what's changed in a country and what's stayed the same. I'd love to tap into that and say, tell me about something in Tanzania that has changed markedly, and tell me about something where it's like you're putting your old familiar coat back on. It hasn't changed at
Yeah,
all.
actually, I usually much prefer going back to a place and feeling it hasn't changed rather than it has. I don't know that's not always like a good thing, perhaps for when I think about some of the places I've been to in Tanzania. So, for example, on the first day I arrived in Tanga, which is a fairly sleepy coastal town in the north, and I had been there in 2011, and I arrived in Tanga and I went to a hotel which, when I checked in, I was like, I have a feeling that I stayed here like 14 or 13 years ago. And the price was exactly the same. And the room, I don't think had any maintenance in that 13 years. It was a different room, but all the rooms, obviously the hotels built at the same time. So all of the beds and the mosquito nets would have been put in like, 20, 30 years ago. And nothing had changed. And in one way, I thought, oh, that's so sad. But in another way, I kind of quite like the fact that it had this kind of time warp feel to it. And going back to a place further south from there, Pangani, which is on the coast, also has a really kind of sleepy backwater kind of like colonial feel to it. So sometimes going back to a new place where it's all been changed and there are new buildings and the roads are busier, I sometimes feel like it's changed, not necessarily for the worse, but it isn't like I remember. Going back to Tanzania, in many ways, I was only there for quite a short time just recently, but I didn't feel that things had changed dramatically. I think in most places, prices of things have gone up. I mean, that's just the same the world over. But the sort of essence of the culture there hasn't really changed that much. Of course, technology has moved on and people have all new phones and so forth. But it's not a region or area that's changing so much, Whereas if you spoke to somebody who went to Dubai like 20 or 30 years ago, obviously it would be a very different place to now. Some parts of the world change much more quickly than others, but I think I feel like a greater sense of comfort going back to places that haven't changed dramatically. Yeah.
I guess there's also that element if you're going back to somewhere, well, maybe this isn't the case, but often perhaps you're also going back there because you have fond memories of a place. So if you go back there and it's different, then your memories are going to be different. Like it's not going to match to what your memories were. I'm not sure whether that's the case in this scenario for you, Peter, or not, but maybe that's a reason.
Yeah, I mean, and the other thing that I hadn't mentioned there is like, you go back and you might not think the place has changed, but obviously, you have because you're 10 or 15 years older. The way that you look at places or yourself or the way that you think other people look at you, might have changed.
You were talking about hotels and the room hadn't changed and, the prices weren't necessarily much different. Something I really loved looking through your travels was your descriptions of this is the most basic hotel room I've had. This is my bucket shower. I wish I paid more for aircon. This is my fan. There is no
Mm.
mosquito net, so I'm going to be staying in my tent. Or there were times in both Kenya and Tanzania where your accommodation was at a schoolhouse, for example. And I really like those insights into Africa
Yeah.
because I feel like it's so vastly different to any way that I've personally traveled before. If you were to describe a quintessential African sort of experience of accommodation and you're not in your tent, for example, what would you tell me to expect?
I don't know, quintessential. Like a typical uh well, I stayed in sort of many kind of basic guest house lodgings, which would be like a ground floor kind of concrete block, which you would enter through a reception, and then there would be like a courtyard behind, which would have basically rooms on either side. And I always talk about places being bike friendly in the sense that they don't have stairs. I always love like arriving at the end of the day when you're quite tired and just you don't have to carry your bike up any stairs. You go into the reception if there is one. You ask if there's a room. You ask how much it is. You go to look at it. You probably already decided that you're going to stay there, and you just basically wheel your bike into the room. I love being able to just wheel the bike into the room because then that takes off the whole worry of like, where's my bike going to stay overnight? Other places in the world where it's like you have to carry your bike upstairs, or the person at the reception says you've got to leave it like somewhere else, even in a different building, and then it's like such a hassle. I just love that simplicity of like rolling the bike in, not having to take any of the panniers off, and within like a minute you just walk into the shower rather than having to like deal with stairways and like lifts and everything like that. So that's quite simple, and most of these places actually, which is also important, because these days so many people like book accommodation ahead. They're using booking.com and so forth, but many of the places that I stay in, like rural Africa, Kenya, Tanzania, wherever it is, they're not on booking.com. They might be on Google Maps, but they might not even be on Google Maps. They might be on iOverlander, they might not be. Basically they're just guest houses, simple places, and as long as they're quiet, clean, you get a feeling of the security based on, is it attached to some kind of bar? Is it going to be noisy at night? And if there are things like this and you have an option not to stay there, then I won't. But my needs are pretty simple. It's affordable, it's clean, it's quiet, it's friendly. There's space for my bike in the room, and I'm paying anything from like 3, 4, 5 pounds a night, which really is great because for a Western traveler anyway, those prices are affordable. So, sometimes I might be staying somewhere which is a bit more luxury. See, the thing about traveling in Africa is most people who experience Africa, who are going to do their safari or so forth, the prices are far different. If you're staying in a lodge or a campsite, which is in a safari park, you're paying far, far, far more than the sort of places that I'm talking about. So there's very much a kind of like two-tiered sort of tourism in many ways in visiting
And total
Africa.
different ends of the spectrum, right?
Absolutely. Most people who go to visit, say, Tanzania or Kenya or lots of countries in Africa, their priority is to obviously go and see animals in safari parks, and none of that is really what you would call budget. You can make it cheaper by doing it in a group, but it's still more likely going to cost hundreds of dollars a day rather than the tens of dollars or less that I would spend. But for many people, it's obviously a tick box experience. You don't do it all the time. You might just do it in one or two countries.
When you're saying these places, they're guest houses, that sometimes they're on Google Maps, sometimes they're not, sometimes they're on Booking, they're not going to be on booking.com. Was it also a case, and I don't remember if it was reading it through your stories there, Peter, where sometimes it was just also you asking where you were buying food, is there somewhere where I can stay? And like a food establishment, sometimes guest houses as well?
You'd usually know. I mean, ironically, in Kenya, most places that call themselves hotels are not actually not actually hotels. They're just like cafe restaurants. If it has rooms, it will say hotel and accommodation.
See, that's what I think I'm remembering. I think I'm
Yeah,
remembering you saying that.
it's kind of obvious from looking at it because sometimes it can just be like a little shack, so you know that it's not going to have.
There's nothing nowhere to stay. And actually, when we talk about food establishments, is it sort of just a given when you're in Kenya? I think I joked with you a few times you're on a diet of beans or rice and that's about it. What are you eating today, Peter? Is it beans?
Yeah,
Is it beans and rice?
I did. And I'm fine to eat that, most days. Of course, a bit of variation would be great, So sometimes I would buy like fruit like avocado or banana, and I mean nobody's traveling really in Africa for the cuisine, the food. If you want to have like varied and great food, then go cycle in Thailand or Vietnam. But most of Africa, no, it's like the staples that you would eat most days. So beans is one, and one thing that I do eat, which I never really would choose to, and because usually I can just have rice, is ugali, which is that's a Swahili word for like pounded maize, really, which is really a staple through most of East and Southern Africa. It's fine. It's just pretty bland. And if rice is on the menu or just available, I would usually have rice.
Yeah, I always thought ugali is sort of like a vessel for other food potentially, but I don't know whether like surely you don't just have ugali on its own, or do you?
No, you don't. You'd have it with beans or you'd have it with like meat. I don't actually eat as much meat when I travel in Africa because I think I might have mentioned it before. You're never actually sure what part of the animal you're going to get and how much bone there's going to be and how much like the inside. So you could get stomach or intestines or whatever. So usually, unless I can see what it is, I probably wouldn't order meat so much. But I'm pretty flexible with what I eat. But yeah, I was eating a lot of, as you saw, a lot of rice and a lot of rice and beans.
Ask then after your how long were you in Kenya for? Was that 2 months?
Yeah, nearly 2 months. Yeah.
So after 2 months of predominantly rice and beans, what was a meal that you were really looking forward to being able to have?
Well, there's loads of stuff. You can't get decent bread there. Yeah, you can get green leaves and salad stuff, but often it's like cooked rather than like fresh. But yeah, like breads, no, you can't get that. I mean, I tend to like think of like what are the great things, and I think the great thing about the food there, which is just like abundance, not everywhere, but in many places of like, fresh tropical fruits that I wouldn't get here. So whether it's pineapple, mango, avocado, bananas, on the roadside, which always taste so much better than they would do if you ever bought them, like in France or the UK. But meal wise, yeah, having something like a great pizza would be amazing, but it's not really happening in rural Africa. And the street food in the evening can be limited as well. See, actually, a lot of places in like rural Africa, when you're traveling and staying in sort of small towns or cycling through them, food is often like made in the daytime. So if it's being cooked over like a charcoal brazier, like, and it's always women who are doing it, by the way, it will start like late morning and then it will be served through lunch and early afternoon. So when it gets to like late afternoon, you're not going to get the same kind of fresh food that you would do because they're spending hours preparing it. So then in the evening, a lot of the time, if it is street food, it tends to be more like fried stuff. So it'd be like it'd be chips, or it'd be like fried chicken or grilled meat, which is fine. But where I'm not getting the vegetables, there isn't so much like greenery, green vegetables. So there are times traveling through Africa where, well, actually, if I'm in a small town and I can see there's no real food options here, I'm just going to buy some stuff from the market and I'm going to use my multi-fuel and cook it in my cook it in my room. I will just make something myself because also, you can be in places where wherever you're staying, if you ask somebody to prepare food, they will, but you could be waiting like an hour or 2 hours for something to be made. I remember in Kenya, yeah, it was pouring it down with rain, and I'd arrived at this kind of guest house, and I could see that they had like grilled meats, and so I'd asked, can I have? And I think it took a good 2 or 3 hours before because they had to get the charcoal and then light the charcoal, and I felt really sorry then for having ordered it because this woman it took hours just to get this meal ready, and it was basically just like a plate of like fried meat and having already ordered it, I couldn't change my mind. Whereas I could probably just make something like much quicker and simpler by myself. That's the context.
Something that was pretty clear to me when I was looking at your tour through Kenya was just how far off the tourist trail you were. I think you might have started on the tourist trail, and is it Hell's Gate?
Yeah, Hell's Gate, so close to Nairobi. Yeah,
As you moved further away from that, I guess the roads possibly become a bit smaller or rougher or whatnot. It also meant that you were exposing yourself to areas where, because there are less tourists, you're having probably more genuine and perhaps unexpected experiences. And for example, if I think of Kenya, I think of the Maasai people and things like that. But you were coming across people from different types of, is it tribes?
yeah, yeah,
And I was looking at your images and I'm like, I didn't even know this existed. And I
yeah.
realize that sounds ignorant of me, but it's part and parcel of you being off the tourist trail. you know about this going into those areas, or were these unexpected encounters for you as well?
No, I'd been to northern Kenya before. I knew that Turkana really is like a different country to like further south, southern and central and western Kenya. So further north, it feels like much like a different country, really. Those counties or provinces are they're much poorer. They have not really been like assimilated into like mainstream Kenyan life. So you'll find more people there are still living like a traditional way of life. So they don't value perhaps education quite in the same way in terms of like going to a westernized kind of school. So yeah, many of the ethnic groups there still dress traditionally, and yeah, it is off the tourist trail. And another reason is it's not seen as a particularly secure part of the country because for a very long period of time been like a lot of intertribal fighting. It's often over livestock. So, one tribe is like stealing like goats or cattle from another, and it often erupts into violence and gunfighting. So that gets reported in the news, and so most Kenyans would not travel to the north of the country. There are incidences of bandits on roads, like stopping vehicles. So I knew all this. However, as a cyclist, as a Western cyclist, even like being in an area where there might have been banditry between like livestock raiding, I didn't really feel like an insecurity. There was one town that I did avoid because I had asked a lot of people, can I go there? And many people had said, avoid this town. And there wasn't anybody who actually said, it'll be fine. So I didn't go there. I made a detour around that. But everywhere else, and I did meet a lot of people living in rural areas, it was absolutely fine. As I say, it's not on the tourist trail, but it feels a lot more adventurous and more authentic. I got a lot more attention in these places. People were more curious to know why I was there, but much more enjoyable and much more rewarding, as it would be in any other country. You tend to remember places like that more so than places that have been visited a lot.
Was that your main motivation for taking that route through Kenya as well? It was off the beaten path. Do you prefer traveling to areas that, are quieter from a tourist perspective?
I think so. Yeah, I mean, it goes together with the landscapes and the ease of like wild camping, quieter roads, like lower population density. In actual fact, I mean that's something. When I look at maps of countries that I haven't been to or I have been to, and I'm thinking of exploring a region, I mean, one kind of map that I always find quite interesting to look at is like a population density map, because that can tell you so much about how it's going to be to travel there. So, for example, I knew that the north of Kenya has a very low population density. That means it's going to be much easier to wild camp. It's going to mean the roads are much quieter, less traffic. It's going to be less polluted and dirty, and perhaps, yeah, like less construction and sort of all the things that you don't really enjoy cycling through as much. Whereas when I went to Tanzania, I kind of knew actually that the northeast is quite fertile, and so because it's quite fertile, it's quite densely populated. So around the slopes of Mount Kilimanjaro, it's really beautiful, but all the land is cultivated. That means camping is actually quite difficult. There's a lot more people, which makes it interesting, but then there's more traffic, and it can just be a little bit more kind of stressful sometimes cycling in places like that. Whereas, being up in the north of Kenya just felt kind of like wild and open, and I love that aspect of it.
Hmm. I can't remember whether it was in Kenya or Tanzania. And I think I said when I told you I wanted to discuss this, it's almost a bit of a cliche, but you had a wild camp where it was quite close to like an elephant crossing or something
Right,
like
yeah.
that.
Yeah.
Where was that?
Yeah, that was in Samburu County. So that's still quite far north. And yeah, I guess I was a bit flippant about it all actually, because like when I cycle through countries, in Saudi, people would say, "Oh no, don't take that track because there are like wolves, or you're not afraid of the wild animals." And been told that so many times. Of course, in Africa, actually, in general, most of the big animals are contained in national parks. But of course, national parks or reserves, they don't have borders. So animals do move between them. Yeah, it so happened that I was like cycling through an area where elephants were like crossing from one region to another. And it just so happened that where I'd put my tent, I thought nobody had seen me, but then it always seems to happen that at some point somebody sees you and then later, someone will come over. Well, it doesn't happen all the time, but it did on this evening. And then this guy came over. He actually spoke reasonable English and he said, "You realize you're camping in an elephant corridor?" And I was like, what does that sort of mean? He said the elephants will tend to come through here at night time. And I'd already pitched my tent and it was getting dark, but he was also quite relaxed about it. He said it should be okay as long as you have the light on in your tent. And then he went away and, I went to bed and it happened to be like a full moon that night. It was really beautiful, clear sky. It was so light and we'd exchanged numbers and he'd sent me a text message at like 9 o'clock at night saying, "You don't need to put the light on in your tent because of the full moon. You'll be okay." And there were no elephants overnight, but then in the morning at sunrise, when I got up, I think to take a photo, I was making tea. I could just suddenly hear noises like, 50 meters, 100 meters behind me. And I turned round and there were two elephants like running. And I think they'd seen me, so they were like running away. And I was very lucky that I had my phone on with the camera ready and I quickly took a 5-second video. So things like that were absolutely amazing. I felt a little bit foolish actually in hindsight for camping there, but at the same time I felt so lucky to have seen that. You see, if I contrasted that with going on a safari and paying a lot of money and being driven or taken to a place where I was guaranteed to see elephants, I would still think it was amazing, but experiencing them in that kind of context was much more special because it just felt unique.
Because, and I said at the start, even bringing this up, it sounds so cliche. We're talking about Africa when we talk about wild animals, but that is part of Africa. And you were there, zebras all around, or giraffes, or stuff like that. What were those animal encounters that you seem to have more often that weren't in a threatening nature? That was just, wow, I'm cycling here and I can't believe this animal is there.
Well, in terms of, yeah, it's not that common that you're just cycling in Africa and seeing elephants and giraffe and zebra. That isn't the case in most of Africa. Animals that you could see quite a lot of in certain places. It could be baboons or monkeys, and in certain places. But other than that, no. I mean, if you're going through a place which is a rural area, which is quite densely populated, you're just going to see the livestock, which is going to be goats, cattle, chickens, not that many dogs. It's mostly livestock because that is a real source of wealth for a lot of people. So parts of all of like sub-Saharan Africa, you have large populations of livestock. And that's always where there's been like a land issue confrontation because national parks like they border on to areas which have been grazed by livestock. So even in Kenya, you can see in some places be cycling along, and I did, and I could see elephants, and then 500 meters later you'll see like a herd of goats. And so it's because people are living closer together and they're trying to make their living from having livestock, but the elephants have been there for much longer.
Peter, it often feels not cheeky, but I imagine it's a hard question to ask. And I ask this now of all my guests, and that is I would like you to tell me about one day of your trip. Any day, any country, any experience. It can be a day which was absolutely magnificent, or it can be a day where it became a bit problematic, a day that filled you with joy, a day that you went to bed exhausted. I don't mind what day it is, but I'd like you to tell me all about it and take me and the listeners there. Tell us all about one day of your trip.
Okay, well, it's a recent one. So it was northern Kenya. This was crossing Lake Turkana. So I wasn't sure whether it would be possible to do it. Geographically, there aren't any roads really around the southern part of the lake. So I was basically cycling to the end of the road to the lake shore, hoping that I could take a boat across this massive like salt lake. And when I got there, there was a guy working at the campsite that I stayed at who told me that it would be possible the next morning. Basically, I went down to the lake shore. It was really, really hot. It was like over 40 degrees. Like that whole part of Kenya is so hot. And I've been told that the boat would leave at 1 o'clock. Of course, it didn't leave at 1 o'clock. I got down there and there were just some fishermen there. And I think, it must have always seemed a bit strange that this foreigner was here with the bicycle. But I'd explained that I wanted to cross the lake. And there was a bit of negotiation, as I knew there would be, about how much I was going to pay. And I'd already been told like what the local fare was. So I was happy to pay a little bit more, especially because I had a bicycle as well. I can't remember what the price agreed was. It was about $15 or something. But I remember getting on this boat, which was a wooden boat. There were about 12 people on the boat. There were a couple of goats. I think there were some sacks of, I don't know if it was sugar, there was some oil. Basically, we were leaving like later that day, and I did feel a bit, yeah, vulnerable because, well, for lots of reasons. Like Lake Turkana has like a really high population of like Nile crocodiles. Well, it used to, and it still does. And this boat was, yeah, it had water in the hold. It was an old wooden boat, but I got on it with my bike and the other people on the boat, and then we started crossing the lake, and the lake was quite windy, so the waves were kind of like lapping up a bit. I was thinking at the time, well, I can swim, so if this thing capsizes, I know I can swim, but I don't think I really want to be like capsizing in this big lake, which supposedly has a lot of crocodiles in it. But fortunately, that didn't happen. What did happen when we got about a kilometer from the far shore is the engine ran out of fuel. Although I thought then we're going to have to paddle to the far shore, but fortunately there was like a spare jerry can of fuel. It took about 3 hours to get across the lake. And then that's when, yeah, I arrived in this small sort of fishing community. I wouldn't even call it a village, just on the lake shore. And there were no roads from there. They were just like, there was a track which was basically leading south along the lake shore, which I was going to take the next day. Yeah, I arrived at this lake shore, and then it was like sunset. And so I'd sort of asked people there if it would be okay to camp. And of course it was. And I had an audience of kids watching me put my tent up. And I was really conscious about how much water I was going to drink because I knew that the next day I wasn't going to be able to find water very easily. I brought about 13 liters with me, and then I obviously needed to drink some going across the lake because it was really hot. And so I'd already drank 2 or 3 liters. And then I needed a bit to cook with. And so the next day I set off with about 9 or 10 liters, which wasn't actually enough. I had to stop and fill up with water from the lake. So that day stands out in Kenya because, well, I was both really relieved that I could actually get on this boat and make it across, because if it wasn't possible, then I was going to have to do quite a long detour and go like all the way back, almost the way I'd come. So I was feeling quite relieved and happy that I'd actually managed to negotiate and get on this boat going across the lake. And yeah, and it felt like, the sort of adventure that I'd like traveled there for, really. I guess a lot of other people perhaps wouldn't have put themselves in that sort of discomfort, both being on the lake, and there was a risk, definitely. I mean, I've taken boats in Africa, in other countries, and every time I get on one, especially like a small wooden one, I always think, well, I know that I can swim, which is something that perhaps many of the other passengers can't do. I'm probably not going to be able to rescue my bicycle because it's just going to sink, but I can swim. But with this crossing, it was more the fact that if I capsized in this lake, would we, then be found by Nile crocodiles? Unfortunately, none of that happened. Yeah.
Swimming becomes totally irrelevant if your legs get munched off
Oh,
by a hungry croc. I can't.
yeah.
Oh my gosh! I was just, yeah. Peter, I'm sort of beside myself just thinking about that. It's the sort of thing in a way you didn't want to know about before. Like
No.
your mind would be more at rest knowing that if you had no concept that there were crocodiles in the lake.
Yeah, there were so many things going on in my mind as we went across this lake. It was everything to do with the boat not really being like, in good condition. It was the fact that the waves were starting to get bigger. It was starting to get quite late in the day. And I actually didn't even know where exactly we were going. I just had my phone with my map, and we were just going across to the lake shore. And really, as we got across the lake, I had no idea what was going to be at the other side, and it was literally just a collection or like a dozen sort of like straw huts with like a community of people who were just probably wondering, what's the crazy Mzungu Westerner doing here? But they saw me with the bicycle, and yeah, they were perhaps just wondering what I was doing. But I think I mean, this was like off the beaten track in Kenya, but Kenya as a whole is not really off the sort of beaten track in the same way that, in other countries I've been to in Africa, people would assume that I was coming with a specific purpose, like I was working for an organization or something like that. They did think that a bit in Kenya as well. I mean, that's another topic altogether, going into like rural communities, perhaps their last encounter with a foreigner would be either like a missionary who's come to do something with the church, or it would be some NGO that's doing something to do with water or agriculture. The fact that it's, or education, the fact that, it's just me on a bicycle, people are kind of a bit perplexed, I think.
I could imagine it. And then, you were saying also that day ended with, being surrounded by children. That to me, and I say this as someone who's not been to Africa, I've interviewed a lot of guests who have, but and something that always comes across is, and I think it was a recent guest, Miriam Belkahel, who's a Moroccan who's currently traveling all the way through Africa. And her quote was, "You're never alone in Africa."
That's true.
Everyone's got that photo of so many people all around you whenever you stop, sort of thing.
That's true. Yeah, you're never really alone. You never sort of can be like anonymous, because you're going to stand out, and you're always going to be like the center of attention, especially like in those rural places like that.
Well, listeners, you definitely want to see the images and the words behind what's happened here. So you definitely need to give Peter a follow. You're most probably active really at the moment on Instagram, aren't you, Peter?
I am, yeah. I still have to write up my Tanzania trip, so I want to do that, and I will put that up on my website. But yeah, I'm mostly just posting updates on Instagram, which feed into my Facebook. The tracks that I do cycle go up on Strava and Komoot, sometimes with a bit of information. So yeah, they're the easiest places to sort of get in touch and find me.
I will post links to all those ways to track Peter in the show notes as well. He's definitely an adventurer to keep an eye on, because it's pretty clear, Peter, when I was asking you about a day of your trip, you could have taken me anywhere. And, we're talking about, this 7-month journey, which is just a small facet of the many, many that you have taken. And something that's pretty clear is there are many adventures still to come. You are planning your upcoming trip, so keep our eyes peeled for where your two wheels are going to take you next as well. But I look at the clock here, I'm nearly at 2 hours, and I just think I always just scrape the surface. I always joke with certain guests, Peter, I need to have a real live camping campfire chat session, because I feel so many of these stories would just be so much better told at a
Yeah, we'll
campfire.
have to try and organize like a Seek Travel Ride meetup somewhere on the
A
road.
little community get together,
Yeah.
and we can have people like yourself who are more at home, not being surrounded by people, being surrounded by enthusiastic bike travelers to
Yeah,
share stories,
that would be great.
which will be great, because it's just been an absolute pleasure. Peter, I always finish the show up asking the same 3 questions. I've asked them to you before. So I'm going to change a couple of them up, but one that I'm not is you get to be one of the very few guests that get to choose an extra song to go on the Seek Travel Ride music playlist.
Yes.
This playlist is on Apple and Spotify, and on it is a song from each guest to be the soundtrack to their adventures. What song are you choosing for this adventure, Peter Gostelow?
Yeah, well, it sounds kind of cliched. I thought maybe, and it is a great song, and I do love it. And I thought maybe it would already be on the playlist, but it's not, because I had a look. So it's "Dreams" by the Cranberries.
Oh, love it.
Yeah.
From memory, your previous song was from Iggy Pop, I'm pretty
Yes.
sure.
Yeah.
All right, Dreams by Cranberries, you are down. You know what? It's a great insight, Peter. We obviously have a very similar music style.
Oh, I'm glad you like them as well.
Okay, then, final 2 questions, and I'm going to change these up a little bit. Let's see what I can come up with. You're given a choice one day. You get to cycle forever in the hot desert heat in Saudi up a never-ending, constant, really steep climb. Or you get the choice to transport yourself to the rainy season in Kenya, where it's maybe not quite as hot, but it's very wet and you're on a very muddy road. Which one are you going to choose?
Yeah, they both sound quite tough. Um, but I will take the second option.
You're going to go to Kenya.
Yeah, I am only because I just sort of put the reality into it, which is it probably wouldn't, if it was raining and really wet, it wouldn't be so crazy hot. And even though it can rain a lot, it's never like constant for uninterrupted. Whereas when you first said the heat going up, pushing up a really steep road, I was like, no, that just sounds like torture. So I'll take the rain and the water. It just sounds more appealing, or the lesser of two evils.
You have a choice one day, Peter Gostelow, and let's see if this trip has changed you. You can choose to cycle for 4 hours on your own or 4 hours in the company of other people. Which one are you going to choose?
Yeah, no, it would be 4 hours in the company of other people, assuming that it's good company. They're riding, we're sharing experiences. We're talking about where we might camp and what we might cook, and then we're talking about our collective experiences. And yeah, that sounds like great. Whereas I've done so much of the cycling by myself that I know exactly how that is. So as long as the company is good and we get on, then I'll definitely take the choice of the company.
Ah, very good. I like the idea that you chose other people. I have had other long-time travelers. They are often default is I cycle on my own all the time, and because it's only 4 hours, I'm happy to cycle with other people because then I can get to doing what I like, which is cycling on my own.
Okay.
But I like that you chose other people without that caveat.
Yeah, I didn't think of it in yeah, if they're terrible company, it's only 4 hours. But yeah, I would choose the company. Yeah.
Well, you know what, Pete Gostelow? One day I hope to have a Seek Travel Ride get together, and I hope to be in your company. We could cycle there for 4 hours together and then have an awesome long campfire chat.
Let's make it happen.
It has been an absolute pleasure to speak with you, to ask you more questions and just hear some more incredible stories. I knew as soon as I would press record that you would tell me things that I didn't know existed beforehand. You would take me to new places and give me a glimpse of those experiences. And I'm sure listeners listening to Peter himself share these stories with you as well, you've been exactly the same. It has been an absolute pleasure, Pete Gostelow. Thank you so much for once again sharing time with me and sharing your story here on Seek Travel Ride.
Yeah, thank you so much for giving me the platform to share that and to, take interest in asking those questions and listening. It's been a pleasure to chat with you again. So yeah, thank you. Thanks so much.
Well, listeners, I knew heading into this interview with Peter that it would be a long one, and I hope that you have enjoyed hearing those amazing adventure stories that he was able to share with us, those experiences that he's had. And it struck me over and over as he was speaking just how all those years of experience that he's had bike touring before have fed into how he now chooses to plan his tours and how he experiences life on the road as well. He knows what to expect in certain countries, but also is able to design a route for himself, which is going to take him to those things which he seeks out in places as well. He's more often than not going to seek out quiet roads, be off the beaten tourist trail, and have those more authentic experiences. Learn more about a country, its people, its cultures, eat the traditional food, and be quite humble and happy to stay in the most budget of budget accommodation so that he can do this day after day after day. And I really thank Peter once again for sharing those stories with us here for the second feature episode with him as a guest on Seek Travel Ride. Thanks so much, Pete. Hey, listeners, if you are enjoying Seek Travel Ride and want to find out more about our guests, our Seek Travel Ride community, and what's coming up on the show, make sure that you are subscribed to the Seek Travel Ride newsletter. I put this newsletter out every few weeks, and in it you'll see who the upcoming guests are going to be, a little extra snapshot of their adventures. We also catch up with previous guests of the show, see what they're up to, and also pose a highlight on the Seek Travel Ride listening community as well. It's a great group of people who have come around this podcast, and I welcome you to join it. To do so, just hit the newsletter sign up link in the podcast show notes and you will be subscribed to Seek Travel Ride news regularly hitting your inbox. Until the next episode, I'm Bella Malloy. Thanks for listening.